Well, it is indeed the most important event probably in the second part of the 20th century. And yet there is a flavor of puzzle or riddle about this war. There is something fundamentally unsatisfactory about our present understanding of the war. Essentially, the conventional narrative, and there are different small differences in variations between Israeli and Arabs, but essentially all of them say it's a story of misunderstanding, misperceptions, deceptions. It's a story of escalating to war that nobody really wanted it. And there is something uncomfortable about that kind of explanation. There is no structural, deep reason for that war. It's all by errors. Introducing the nuclear dimension, a dimension that indeed at the time, at least on the Israeli side, caused a great deal of concern, even though it was not a public concern, help us to offer a different narrative to the origins of that war. And indeed, it put together a body of evidence that was hardly and largely invisible at the time and for many, many years. In addition to all that, there is a certain kind of revelation that will bring in the fact that Israel was essentially, during the crisis, was crossing the nuclear threshold, and that's quite a big deal. So it allows us to open new kind of questions that were largely put aside for the last 50 years. The new evidence that we provide here, some of it for the first time, some of it has been obscure for a long time, allow us to revisit the origins of the crisis in a new light. It sheds a new light on the story that led to the war, in particular on the Israeli side. There is still some ambiguity or unclarity, and we hope actually to have a similar story on the Egyptian side. But as far as the Israeli side, concerns about Egyptians' intentions vis-a-vis Dimona played a major role, to some extent even central role, certain days during the crisis. After the war, somewhat it disappeared for censorship, self-censorships, and a general taboo on the nuclear issue. Bring it again 50 years later, allow us to revisit the origins of the war. In the previous narratives, including recent narratives, some of them bring some elements of that evidence, and yet they do not see it as a central, they see it as a side. I believe, at least in terms of opening as a new questions, I think time has come to think whether it was a central issue that led to the war. So bringing the body of evidence together, plus the fact that realizing that in Israel, indeed it played a real role when Israel was crossing the threshold, at least in the mind of the few people who were aware of that, including Prime Minister Eshkol. All this together allow us to look again at the war in a new light. Well, the reason why I decided to do it now are twofold. One is, of course, the big anniversary, 50 years. And I believe that this is the last remaining obscure dimension of the war, in particular the preparations on the Israeli side. It is hardly being told. And to the extent it was said, it was only by way of hint. And second, the protagonist who provide us this testimony, General Yitzhak Yaakov, nicknamed Yatza, is by now dead. He died in 2013. He wanted the story to be out. When he tried to do it in his own life, he got into troubles. He had trial, he was arrested, he had a trial. And in a way, I promised to him in my own heart that at the right time I'll do it for him and for history. And I believe this is the right time to do it. The question, how close Israel was to do this Shimshon operation is intriguing one, and it's not easy to be answered. In retrospect, it was not close at all, because obviously Israel succeeded in the aerial attack, the Moked plan to destroy the Arab Air Force. Essentially, the first sortie did it in 80 minutes. By 3 hours, it was done and it was over. However, if you look again at the crisis, especially between the 25th and the 28th of May, Egypt was ready to launch an attack. It was canceled in the very last moment on the dawn of the 27th. There was a great deal of uncertainties. Had Egypt launched the attack, it's difficult to predict what would have happened. And it was a really existential crisis. For example, we're bringing here a document, meeting of the Israeli Knesset Defense Committee. Shimon Peres, at the time, was opposition leader. He was stating what was understood by many: this is the crisis which is even worse than what was in 1948. So there was a sense of existential crisis. The desire to have a special option, a doomsday option for the prime minister, given the uncertainty, was real one. So could have been circumstances under which this proposition, Shimshon proposition, would have been considered. In the context of what actually happened, no, it was never close to be done, even though Yatza and his small team was ready on the first day to be mobilized. I believe it is significant. I believe it is significant because, first, it's a point of connection between Israel nuclear history and world nuclear history, where Israel, it's a milestone which is not only important for Israel, but it's important for world nuclear history. Also, there are certain kind of reflections that the whole thing gives us about memory, about the fragility of memory, about it even the players are not sure about many of the things, so there are certain profound uncertainties and ambiguities about memory. Certain things are being remembered, certain things are not being remembered so vividly. And also there is a lesson about nuclear weapons, that even if you don't know exactly how you're going to use them, their presence, their possessions in the mind of decision makers is important. There is something quite magic about it. In the past, even in the most recent history, that did acknowledge some of the evidence that we bring this time, in particular about the Egyptian flights over Dimona, and also Israeli concerns about the bombing of Dimona. Those concerns were not that central. This collection and this narrative trying to put it in a more central way. I do not pretend this is the final word, but I would like to bring this new evidence into discussion among historians, and I am curious what other historians would say about it. So I would like to get the discussion among among historians about the origins of the war to reignite it. And I'm curious where it will go. I cannot predict, of course.